If you live in the United States and you enjoy wine from countries like France, Italy, Spain, and other parts of the EU, you may soon be in for some serious sticker shock. That's so because earlier this week, President Trump threatened 200% tariffs on wines and other alcoholic beverages from the EU. I pursue my passion for wine, including making these videos on YouTube, in large part as a creative outlet or a break from dealing with some of the complicated legal and political issues that I deal with on a daily basis in my legal career. But given this week's headlines, it didn't seem right to just publish a routine, business-as-usual wine video and ignore the elephant in the room. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing the potential wine tariffs, what they are, what they mean, the potential impact, and perhaps most importantly, steps that you can take between now and the time that they might be implemented to help protect yourself or mitigate some of the damage that the tariffs might cause to you personally. Just to make sure that everyone's on the same page before we dig in a little deeper, I'll briefly start by discussing what a tariff is and why they're important. Simply put, a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So say, for example, a bottle of Chianti Classico Reserva sells for $25 per bottle. If that wine is subject to a 200% tariff, then the price of that wine will increase by $50 per bottle, and the new price will be $75 per bottle. To be sure, tariffs are not new, and they've been around for hundreds of years, if not longer. Many countries impose taxes on imported goods, including wine. In some instances, this is done as a revenue-raising measure, and in other instances, it's a form of protectionism. For example, if a particular country is trying to protect its domestic wine industry, it may add a tariff to the price of imported wines so that the price of those imports is relatively less attractive and so that more consumers within their country will purchase domestic wines rather than the imported wines. Unfortunately, wine and alcohol generally are frequently the subject of tariffs in a number of countries worldwide. For example, if you go to Asia, with the exception of Hong Kong, you'll most likely find that the price of imported wine is comically expensive. I was in Thailand a few years ago, for example, on New Year's Eve, and I was looking to enjoy some wine with dinner, and to my dismay, many of the bottles on the wine list that sell for around $8 or $9 in the United States sold for around $100 per bottle US in Thailand. Fortunately, however, many countries and other governmental organizations will enter into free trade agreements whereby certain products can be imported or exported without being subject to tariffs. The EU, for example, is a free trade zone that allows members to import and export products within the European Union without tariffs. The EU does impose tariffs on wine imported from many non-member countries, although it does have trade agreements with countries such as South Africa and Chile that provides those products with relatively favorable tax treatment. Some of you may be experiencing a bit of déjà vu and wondering how this relates to the tariffs that were imposed on some EU wines back in 2019 during the first President Trump administration. That situation was a little bit different, however, as those tariffs were imposed as the result of a ruling in the United States' favor by the World Trade Organization. More specifically, the United States had filed a complaint with the WTO arising out of some allegedly improper subsidies from the EU to Airbus. The United States prevailed in that arbitration and won a $7.5 billion verdict that authorized it to use countermeasures and impose tariffs against certain EU products. So they ultimately chose to implement a 10% tariff on aircraft and a 25% tariff on some other goods that included wine. Those particular tariffs were limited to products from 4 countries that were the countries that were providing the subsidies to Airbus. Those tariffs were ultimately repealed as part of an agreement between the EU and the US about a year or two after that. So why has this issue come up again? Well, rightly or wrongly, President Trump believes that the United States is being treated unfairly by some of its trade partners, including the EU. For that reason, President Trump imposed a tariff on imported steel and aluminum coming into the United States. My personal belief is that President Trump's endgame is the negotiation of what he believes to be more favorable trade agreements with some of the U.S. trading partners, including the EU. In fact, it's been interesting to see the reaction of various countries and how their approach differs. For example, countries like the UK and Mexico are not happy with the tariffs on steel, but they're negotiating quietly in the background rather than publicly announcing retaliatory tariffs of their own. Of course, if those negotiations do not succeed, I would fully expect those countries would announce retaliatory tariffs against the United States in due course. The EU took a different approach and instead announced retaliatory tariffs to the tune of $26 billion on a wide variety of products ranging from boats to bourbon to Harley-Davidson motorcycles. In response, President Trump threatened to impose 200% tariffs on all wine, champagne, and alcohol products coming out of the EU unless those retaliatory tariffs were not dropped. Fortunately, it seems like both sides are moving very quickly to negotiate a potential resolution to this dispute, as it's my understanding that there will be discussions taking place as early as March 15. So hopefully there will be a quick and amicable resolution to this dispute, and there won't be additional tariffs imposed by either the EU or the United States on alcohol or wine in the near future. In the meantime, a number of impacted industries in the United States have launched a Toasts Not Tariffs campaign. In a social media post in which he announced this potential retaliation, President Trump claimed that these potential tariffs would be great for wine and champagne businesses in the United States. Presumably, he means domestic wine producers and sparkling wine producers, since by definition, champagne cannot be produced in the United States. To be sure, it's possible that these protectionist tariffs might increase domestic sales for producers of wine and sparkling wine in the United States. The problem, however, is that it would greatly limit the ability of some of these domestic wine producers to export their own products. We've already seen situations where Ontario, for example, removed United States wine and alcohol from the shelves. So while it's possible that tariffs may increase domestic sales for some wine producers, these domestic sales increases could be more than offset by a reduction in export revenue. Worse yet, these tariffs are potentially devastating for the wine industries both in Europe and in the United States. In fact, studies have shown that for every $1 that the US spends in imports of wine and alcohol from the EU, that more than $4 is generated in the United States through the distribution channels. And of course, the United States is either the top export market, or at least in the top 3, for the vast majority of wine producers in the EU. So certainly there's a number of producers and exporters that would be devastated in the EU if these tariffs would go into effect. To be sure, if these 200% tariffs actually take effect, that will send shockwaves through a wine industry that's already beleaguered due to reduced consumer demand. So how can you prepare and respond? Well, there's several action items that you might consider. First, if you oppose these tariffs, you definitely want to make yourself known and let your representative know how you feel about the issue. Second, if you want to err on the side of caution, you may want to go ahead and load up on wines from the EU immediately before these tariffs take effect. Inventory channels are flush with a number of products from the EU that were imported without the tariffs being added. In fact, I read some headlines from earlier this year that a number of distributors and importers were getting ahead of these potential tariffs by importing a large number of EU wines into the United States earlier this year. So those are all wines that you should be able to purchase now without any additional expense associated with tariffs. And definitely also make sure to support businesses that would be negatively impacted by these potential tariffs. So that would include specialty retailers and even restaurants that have large and interesting selections of EU wines, such as Italian restaurants. While no one likes uncertainty, and these tariffs could have far-reaching consequences for wine enthusiasts, collectors, and wine businesses throughout the world, by taking action and staying informed, we can hopefully navigate these difficult times successfully.